I hope you'll agree that this is a magnificent venue for any event, particularly for the Liburne conference, given that the man himself is actually buried in the Bedlam churchyard just across the road there. My name is Rees, I'm one of the organisers of the conference. I just want to welcome you here and to say thank you to a number of people who've helped us to organise the conference. In particular, the Bishopsgate Institute itself. It was organised jointly in partnership with the Bishopsgate and the staff here. Stephen Dickers, the remarkable librarian, if you don't know him, of the Bishopsgate, Lucy Kerr, Lisa Roberts on the staff here have been absolutely terrific in the whole organisation of the event. I'm grateful to the Emil and Melbourne Trust for a grant enabling us to produce the publicity and to pay the expenses of the conference. Grateful, very grateful indeed for the support from other organisations that were involved in continuing the memory of the radicals of the Civil War, in particular to the organisers of the Levellers Day in Burford, the annual march and celebration. Megan Godwin will be speaking to you in a moment, and she's one of the organisers of that event. The support that we've had from the National Civil War Centre, which is Michael Constantine, who's also about to speak, will tell you the first time there has actually been a national centre dedicated to the memory of the Civil War in this country, to Unite the Union, and to Verso Books, who've also supported the event. Last but not least, I'm extremely grateful to the first people to back the conference, who were the History Department, my department, at Goldsmiths College. They not only supported it, but the Goldsmiths Annual Fund contributed money towards the mounting of the conference. So it's entirely appropriate for that reason and many others. I hand you over to the chair of the first session, who is Vivian Richmond, who's head of history at Goldsmiths. Vivian.
Thank you, Joe. Indeed, welcome everybody to this first session. We have 4 speakers, and they're each going to speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll gather some questions together, and they'll each have a couple of minutes to respond. The exception being Megan, who has to nip off at 12 o'clock, so may not be here for the questions. But our first speaker is indeed Megan Dobney, who is from South East TUC and is one of the organisers of the National Levellers Day in Burford.
Thanks, Vivian. And I want to say, first of all, a couple of words about CERTAC for context. The Southern and Eastern region of the TUC, which it's my privilege to be the regional secretary of, is the largest TUC region, comprising 2 million trade unionists and 1/3 of the country geographical. And it includes many of the places famous for their involvement with the Levellers. Burford, that's been mentioned, but also, of course, Putney, the Isle of Wight, Windsor, Banbury, and, of course, Bishopsgate. And I'm very pleased and slightly nervous to be sharing a session with such prestigious colleagues who are sitting over there. I also admit to being very partisan and believe that trade unions should be at the centre of all social, cultural and political movements. After all, we are the largest voluntary organisation in the country, and with 6 million members, we're in every family in the land. There is no escape. I was aware of, although to my shame had never attended, not even when I was an activist, the annual Levellers Day events in Burford in Oxfordshire. So when I was approached by some local trade unionists for support, it was obvious that we needed to respond positively. Local trade unions have always been involved, and the Workers' Education Association, who initiated the commemoration in 1975, are still central. But for the last 3 years, CERTAC has also been a major partner in the organisation of the Levellers Day events. So before I go on, I must insist that you make a note of the details. You can pick up a flyer outside, I believe, which looks like that. Saturday the 16th of May from 10:30 a.m. There'll be the usual dedication to Cornet Thompson, Prather Perkins and Corporal Church. a march through the charming Tory town of Burford with banners, pikemen, Morris dancers and drums, and a debate, stalls and children's activities in Burford Recreation Park. The theme this year is Education, the Key to Democracy, and we will be welcoming Professor Danny Dorling, Melissa Ben and Kevin Courtney from the NUT, Teachers Union, to open the subject up to common participation. So that's the advert done, see you there. But I might add that thanks to the colleagues who have put this on, and John in particular, we have an additional event this year, which looks less colourful, but it's just as interesting. The night before, we'll be having a, I suppose, seminar, discussion, whatever you want to call it, marking Liburne's 400th anniversary. And we'll have 3 speakers, Ted Vallance, John Rees and Anne Hughes, looking at various aspects of Liburne, and that will take place on the Friday evening in the Communication Workers Union's training centre in Alverscott, which is fabulous. And there are a limited number of bedrooms available for those who want to stay over. Okay, that is definitely the advert done. Now, I admit to not being much of an historian. The subject fell off my curriculum early on in secondary school, and I spent my early working life in the print, active in the National Graphical Association, the Graphical Paper and Media Union and Amicus, until I became a trade union bureaucrat 9 years ago. So when I read about an organisation that had insignia, collected subscriptions, met in local pubs and dumped on women, despite having a forceful group of women who demanded change, I felt at home immediately. But of course, what matters now is what we can learn. And as John Rees said in his piece last month in the Guardian newspaper on the discovery of the bones of Robert Lockyer and John Liburne, the democracy they fought for remains only partially achieved. The legal rights they made part of the English political vocabulary are under threat. Most of all, the contest between property and democracy still rages. And here we are. We enjoy the rule of a government nobody elected, enacting policies ditto, and the majority's access to democracy remains at floor level. So what are the real challenges? Here's a couple. First, participation in our democracy is a real challenge. Turnout in the last general election was 65.1%, so 1 in 3 people didn't bother. And to be fair, it's not just Parliament. I looked at a couple of recent Trade Union General Secretary elections. One of the TUC's major general unions had a turnout of around 15%. A major teaching union had around 10%. But that, of course, was the intention when the Tories changed the balloting law to make it a postal vote from the home. When I worked in the print, ballots were secret, but conducted in the workplace. The FOC or MOC would collect the envelopes and chase up the membership to vote. And all things are possible, of course. The turnout in Scotland for the referendum was 84.5%. But democracy is not just a cross on the ballot paper. I will remember one of my tutors at the London College of Printing saying, "Democracy is like a diamond. It has different forms depending on how the light shines upon it." My second point, legal rights do not exist without the resources to exert them. Resources needed might be money, in the upfront way, such as employment tribunal fees. Since workers have had to pay fees to lodge a claim, there's been a massive 70% drop in claims, a drop that is over 90% for sex discrimination claims. So a worker has to find £160 for a basic claim and another £230 if it goes to a hearing. This could be under a claim under the Wages Act, for instance. It might just be £80, £90 in unpaid wages. More complex claims, such as unfair dismissal or discrimination, are £250 to lodge a claim and £950 for a hearing. This really is a class act, by definition, those putting in a claim are workers, even if well-paid workers. I want now to use the examples of two modern-day ranters that might help us. One is Bob Crow, the other is a collective ranting exercise, Prime Minister's Question Time. What's the difference? One, Bob Crow, former General Secretary of the RMT Union, was, sadly, in the past tense, authentic, full of passion and love. The other, Prime Minister's Question Time, is full of petty point scoring and grammar school or public school clever dickness. So the lessons might be, it's in our hands. Class politics are merely window dressing if we robe them in cynicism. As I was writing this, I had the radio on and heard Owen Jones say this, the columnist author. We can do better than lowest common denominator grubby debate. I think that sums it up very well. It might be that I'm a romantic, that my opinion is suggestive of an idealised view of reality. But I say no, it's founded on the belief that a better world is possible. Disillusion leading to cynicism are the enemies of democracy in my view. And with that in mind, I follow the events in recent interest. So comrades, I have a simple recipe. For working class progress, we need 1, superb bureaucracy, and 2, total commitment to the class and to honesty. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Megan. Our second speaker is Michael Constantine from the soon-to-be-opened National Civil War Centre in Newark, which is the first ever national centre dedicated to the history of the Civil War. And Michael's going to speak and then he's going to show us a short film.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. The National Civil War Centre in Newark will be opening on the 3rd of May. It's a very messy building site at the moment, as we spend around £6 million converting this range of buildings into the first centre dedicated to telling the story of the British Civil Wars of the 17th century. It's a full spectrum, all the toys in the toy box, heritage museum. We'll be having loans from the Royal Armouries, the Museum of London and the Science Museum, as well as the objects that we have ourselves. We have the physical and digital interactives that you'd expect. We have the dressing up areas that you can dress up in civilian and military clothing and all the kind of things you would expect to see in an attraction that is also a fully qualified museum. You might recognise this character. Some of you do. We'll be telling the story not from the point of Newark being the centre of the Civil Wars, because it wasn't. I'm not a Newark person, so I'm quite happy to come in and say that Newark, we're using as an example. Newark, we have the real stories of the real people in the real place, but we're using them as examples for the Civil War experience that was across the countries. You know, the Civil War starts in Scotland, arguably finished in Ireland, although some academics insist they finish out of the colonies. But we'll be telling those stories right the way through. So we have the lead up to the Civil Wars. We're using, instead of hanging panels on the walls, we're creating new walls and we're digitally printing. So if you imagine this room and the whole of that brown wood panelling was going to be covered in graphics, this is what we're able to do. So we're able to reproduce the portraits of the time, and in the ghosted out images we're able to highlight those smaller objects and we'll be able to explore them. Those white boxes will be exhibition cases where we'll be having the real objects that we'll be able to see. But of course, we have the lead up to the Civil Wars, we have the Civil Wars themselves. In our legacy section, we have the man himself, John Liburne. Yeah, his legacy, and that's why we're here today, is around the freeing up of politics. They did suffer for it. John Liburne was captured and surrendered outside Newark during the second siege of Newark's 3 sieges, and we'll be able to feature him at a very, I won't say superficial level, but that level where we can engage people's interest. The academics have drafted probably 2,000 words on each of these panels, and we and the academics have worked to reduce them down to 200. Those people that read the Metro newspaper, as you're all probably commuters in one way, shape or form, the Metro takes journalism to the ultimate degree. If you read the analysis of how you read newspapers, generally you read the first 3 paragraphs and then the last one. The Metro recognises that. Within museum interpretation, we could put 2,000 words on the wall. Many of you would probably read it. Most of our visitors would not. They would be turned off by this and they would not recommend us. But what we do is we get them interested in this, and there are digging deeper points where they can explore their interests further. So we'll have religion, finance, Scotland, Ireland, politics, overseas. All these will be different layers that the visitor will be able to explore the story throughout the museum. This is what the museum looks like from graphic representation from the other end. But what we are doing is we're using technology. And the reason I'm able to show you a film at the end is we've got a cinema inside, and we also have an augmented reality town trail. It's the biggest one that has been done outside the museum. What we've done is, Newark was besieged 3 times. We've done a digital representation of the town of Newark as it was besieged in the 3rd siege. This is a very small excerpt of that. The overall siege, the final siege of Newark, spreads to 40 square kilometres. That is the scale of the 16,000 Scots and parliamentarians who were besieging Newark and the 2,000 to 3,000 royalists who were defending it. Luckily, Charles comes and surrenders to the Scots. The local people say he was captured, but he did come a long way from Oxford to be captured by the Scots. He then insists, the Scots then insist as part of the deal of accepting his surrender, that he makes Newark surrender to them, which they have to ask him twice to do. He sends in the first order and Newark rejects it. Luckily for them, they see sense on the second time and surrender. Otherwise, this would have been one of those, under the rules of wars, significant death toll massacres. But what we're able to do is, I've worked on many heritage attractions where you get a film. And the film usually costs between £30,000 and £50,000, which sounds like a lot of money until you see it on a 42-inch plasma screen and it doesn't look very good. What we're able to do, because we have the augmented reality town trail where you can go around the real town of Newark, which some people would say is a backwater, some people would say is a very picturesque town. You can explore the real people in the real place with the Civil War buildings there. Because we had such a bulk of filming, we've got a screen that's larger than this, with full Dolby surround sound, so we're able to bring the story of Charles and Rupert having their ding-dong in the governor's house, Hercules Clay's house getting blown up, Mrs. Goniston selling plague cures outside the church, all these real stories that we know existed and happened in Europe, and symptomatic of those stories that go throughout the Civil War, we're able to do in the Civil War Centre. The Civil War Trail is where we take people around the town of Newark. We have the largest and the best preserved 17th century earthwork at the Queen's Sconce that features at the end of the film. We've taken local and nationally renowned actors, we've put them in the costumes, the scripts have been done by academics, so we know that these are the real stories that we're telling. And we're engaging the public through a free app, which you can download now. You can play the trailer, which was triggered from the leaflets that you found on your seats. And we're able to then take people to, bring people to Newark to then engage them in the story in an interesting, informative way, which then means we can hook them in and we can bring them into the crazy world of 17th century civil wars. But it's not just about the civil wars of the 17th century, because although we're the national centre and we expect lots of people to turn up, we're also contemporising those ideals. So, we're working with the Magnum Photos, a photojournalist collective, and we're exploring their archives about propaganda from the 17th century and what does modern propaganda look like. So we have images from Kaplan taken from the Civil War. We also have images from Northern Ireland, because censorship is not necessarily about the state censoring, it's also about self-censorship. An awful amount of images which we would never get to see as the public because the newspaper editors and their owners will censor it. Picture in the middle on the right was taken during the Northern Ireland Troubles in 1972. It shows soldiers giving Irish people a kicking. Funnily enough, this was not broadcast, although it was put in other papers. This was not published in the British media, because Magnum Photos, they make money by selling photos to lots of other people, so they'll sell them to whoever buys them. And they don't take the photos and then work out who they're going to sell them to, they just take the photos and then pitch them out. But all this is relatively kind of nice, and that's what we do, and we've created this wonderful thing, but until we do the publicity about it, nobody will come. We'll have built a fantastic white elephant in Newark and nobody will turn up. However, what has been incredibly gratifying for me and for the rest of the project is how the idea of a National Civil War Centre really has captured the media's and people's attention. There is that question as to why hasn't there been a National Civil War Centre? Why only now are we building it? One of our academics has answered that in terms of saying that whose interest has it been until now to start to remember the Civil Wars? And now that we have, the potentially future king saying he's going to be more involved with government, yes, we are worried about that. And why are we worried about that? Because we hark back to the 17th century. We say, this is when it went wrong then. This is why we want him to come and open the Civil War Centre in about 6 months' time. So we can just take it through. No names go back, but whichever Prime Minister happens to be in post, we'll have him and King Charles and he can work with us. So, the other thing that we're doing is so all of those people are covering us, but we're having a massive reenactment event on the 3rd and 4th of May. The English Civil War Society and the Seal Knot are coming to Newark. There'll be over 1,000 reenactors at our castle and at the sconce and at the Civil War Centre, bringing Newark back to Civil War life and a recreation of the sieges of the Fortress Newark. And hopefully now, if I look to the young assistant at the back left, he's going to play a film which gives us a kind of idea as to the digital content that will be available both on the apps and in the cinemas, and it's what really sets us apart from your standard museum or heritage centre experience. So, if we play the film.
Of the 18th and 19th centuries. Most remarkably of all, he was closely associated with the campaign for a written constitution, an agreement of the people, which would enshrine the principle that the power of the state rested on the will of the people. Central to this career was the force of his personality. Wholly admirable for his political commitment, there is nonetheless something maniacal and destructive about Liburne the man. A serial martyr to religious and political causes, he was careless of his own safety and no doubt infuriatingly, cussedly committed to his opinions. He was a better ally to the ideas he supported than to the friends with whom he travelled. His life also tells us something about the genesis of the great ideas with which he's associated, and this is the second reason for writing a book about him, I think. He's associated notably with the idea that the authority of government rests ultimately with the will of the people they govern. Since 1945, this idea has been taken for granted across much of the globe. What makes the actions of parliaments and presidents legitimate is that they are in the end accountable to the will of the people. This is now such a familiar idea that it's difficult to imagine a world in which it's unfamiliar. Of course, there are many political systems where the principle is not accepted or honoured, and many where it's formally accepted but imperfectly acted upon, not least our own. But there can now be very few where it's an unfamiliar thought. In 17th century Europe, however, it was an extremely unconventional view. The clear articulation of this idea and the attempt in 1648 and 1649 to establish a government based, at least in part on it, was remarkable. It's easier to understand, of course, a good idea than to have one. Through the tumultuous decades of rebellion, civil war, revolution, Liburne's thinking was clarified, leading him to some certainties which have run down the ages. But his is just one example of a more general phenomenon in revolutionary England. According to one scholar, these were the epic years of the English political imagination. In that sense, Liburne's experience was widely shared. To understand his creativity and how his ideas took hold is at the same time to understand the conditions from which they arose. And that's my third reason for writing a book about him. In his case, this is partly about how his personality became the vehicle for political agitation around these ideas, how Liburne came to embody these ideas and thereby help foster their circulation and a degree of acceptance. He used his own fame quite consciously as the vehicle for political campaigns, and his image was constructed using the newly liberated presses by him and by others. His career therefore reveals something more general about the politics of revolutionary England, the media in which new ideas and new ways of seeing the world were generated and given political influence. It takes us into the world of illegal print, street demonstrations, dawn raids, military campaigns, and the courtroom. The ideas that were voiced touched on many areas crucial to what we would now call the open society, not just popular sovereignty, but religious toleration and equality before the law. These are just particular threads in a rich, even chaotic world of public debate, in which, for example, a prophet set up camp on Blackheath to await Armageddon, or others ploughed the common fields in Surrey, and a republic was declared. These decades gave rise not just to John Liburne, but to John Milton and to Thomas Hobbe's greatest works, as well as others only slightly less renowned, such as James Harrington and Andrew Marvell. The debates that emerged stimulated a longer argument reaching across the Atlantic and the English Channel in the 18th century and in Britain forward into that other period of heroic political reform, the 19th century. Part of that story, of course, is how outlandish much of Liburne's own thought is to us. He shared with many contemporaries an intense religiosity that is often difficult for us to comprehend, and the immediacy with which he felt God's intervention in everyday political life can appear very alien. In celebrating him for his commitment to secular political rights, we're stripping away much of what he himself would have thought most important, some of the key arguments in which he was engaged, and much of what he shared with his contemporaries. Nonetheless, something about how he entered these contemporary debates survived the immediate context, appealing not just at the time, but to subsequent generations. His writing and the example of his actions appealed more easily to the less zealous Restoration and 18th century audiences than that of other 17th century radicals. His concentration on legal rights grew out of his experience of the quest for religious freedoms, but was more easily comprehensible to a subsequent generation than some of the more directly inspired writing of his contemporaries. As a result, he's been remembered, read and imitated more continuously between then and now. Liburne had a long career as an activist, extending before and after the Leveller campaigns, and in tracing the evolution of his political practice and his key ideas, we're also exploring the broader dynamics of political life in these decades. Liburne was a product of the English Revolution, and understanding how it made him is also to understand fundamental features of that revolution. Liburne's serial battles with authority were fought out in public, through the presses, in courts and on the streets, through petitions and demonstrations. He gave these abstract battles a very concrete reality, and by publicising his life, he constructed an image that became the vehicle for the promotion of his political causes. His steadfastness and strength of purpose in the face of immense suffering was the guarantee of the truth of his cause. The conscious construction and manipulation of this image by him, his friends and his opponents reveals something important about how politics was done in revolutionary England. The use of print, changes in popular politics and the relationship between Parliament and the nation. It would not have been possible to have such a career 20 years earlier, but his model was much imitated in the following centuries, consciously so, in fact. So I'm interested in more than Liburne the Leveller. I'm interested in what his experience reveals about the transformations of political life in revolutionary England, as well as the lasting effects of some of those transformations on our thinking about fundamental issues and how we engage with political life. Liburne does not capture the essence of the revolution in what he thought or how he lived his life, but his individual experience of the revolution reveals some of its core dynamics. In a way, and most fundamentally, his life offers a case study of how ideas happen, how they take root, influence events, how they become compromised, and how they live on. Thanks.
Thank you, Michael. Our final speaker, I suspect, needs no introduction, but I will nevertheless tell you that he is Jeremy Corbyn MP.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I have the difficult job of being a socialist and a Labour MP at the same time, but I'm doing my best. First of all, a big thank you to everyone that's put the event on today, but particularly to John Rees for basically doing so much to promote the Levellers and John Liburne and the society as a whole. And I've never forgotten John badgering me to death to take a group from the society on a visit to the House of Commons, and we started off with a tour of the building, and after the first 10 minutes of the third correction to my interpretation of history that had happened by this extremely well-informed group that John brought along with him, I stopped trying to give them a guided tour, and every place we got to I said, right, tell me what happened here. And so it became a one-person education session for me, and I was genuinely very grateful for it. And there are local connections to the English Civil War, to John Liburne and to the Levellers in my constituency, Islington North, in that Michael's promised to try and find this out. We're going to keep looking. I read a reference somewhere that at the Nag's Head in Holloway, Liburne and Cromwell held a parley sometime 1648, 1649. Sadly, the pub was rebuilt many times and eventually closed, and is now an outdoor gaming centre, which is more than a bit depressing. It would be a dream, wouldn't it, if the National Lottery decided to buy the place and turn it into a Civil War museum in London. Wouldn't that be a better use of the building? And of course, locally, I'm going over there in a moment, we have other memories of people that learnt, if you like, from the English Civil War and the rights of people, and that is Newington Green, where Mary Wollstonecraft lived and wrote the treatise on the rights of women. I think we have to understand the significance of the English Civil War, and we have to understand the role of history. And one of the most depressing things I find is the way that two things are happening in Britain. One is history is being increasingly influenced by the, I'm sure, very profound thinkings of Michael Gove on the place of Britain in the world, and the way in which British supremacy is so important and British values are so important. I'm still trying to work out what these British values are, because I thought human rights, justice, democracy, and all those issues were actually universal values rather than national values, and perhaps we should think about that. And also the increasing militarisation and militarism within our society. But if we look at the huge significance to our own history of the English Civil War, it should be centrepiece in what our children are learning in school, because it challenged so many things. It challenged the divine right of the power of kings to declare war, to administer society, to make gifts, to dismiss parliaments, to put people in prison. It did all of those things. It also asserted the power of elected parliaments over the monarch and over the barons and the powers that be, through the work of Mr. Speaker Lenthal at the time, when he expelled the King from the House of Commons, and that was one of the things that sparked off the English Civil War. But like all English and British things, it ends up with some ghastly compromise, because when the monarchy was re-established some years later, the independence and the autonomy of the House of Commons was maintained, and in a sense still is maintained, but the then two principal officers of the House of Commons, the Speaker and Sergeant-at-Arms, are restricted to appointment by the Commons subject to royal approval. And so when a Speaker is elected in the Commons, John Bercow, I remember very well when he was elected, the elected Speaker then has to go to the House of Lords, stand with his hat removed in front of the Lords Commissioners and pledge his allegiance to the Crown rather than his allegiance to Parliament. And that is a fundamental point, and one of the many fundamental points in the British Constitution. So the other issue is, of course, the one of democracy and the principle of electing people to a Parliament and holding them to account. That was, as Michael was explaining, an extremely revolutionary concept in the 17th century. It's not seen as particularly revolutionary now, but the corruption of democracy by money, the corruption of democracy by privilege and place, the corruption of democracy by patronage is the most serious issue that's facing our times, and the inability of democracies in a national sense to hold to account global forces, and particularly global corporations and global finance. Of course, a whole thing that was completely unheard of in the 17th century and unheard of indeed for a very long time after that. Lilburne's life I find absolutely fascinating. I can't pretend to be an expert on it, but why was he so different to so many others? He came from a modest but not totally impoverished background. He had the possibility of a professional life and professional career. He could have probably been quite comfortably successful in his life. He was very successful in his life in inspiring others. He was an extremely difficult character, and I think of plenty of people who model themselves on John Liburne, where they're obsessed with their ideas and forget that they need friends in order to achieve those ideas, getting through to success. The House of Commons is absolutely full of them, of different types. But he had this utter determination and was tried for treason all those times, was freed by a jury vote on the last occasion, and had always this vision of a different society, a society of democracy and a society of accountability. And at the end of his life, joined the Quakers, which was of itself a rebellious act, because the Quakers were of course something that was seen as extremely dangerous to the established church and the power that went with the established church, and indeed were banned from many parts of the country at that time. He died in the end after visiting various Quaker meeting houses in Kent while he was on his way to see his newborn daughter. Those turmoils of the times of the English Civil War and the life of Liburne and all that goes with it were ones of the most amazing production of pamphlets, leaflets, treaties and writings, and many of them have survived, which is quite remarkable. Why did it happen? It happened because Liburne, the Levellers particularly, were very adept at using modern technology, the idea of printing, hence their battle with the Stationers' Company, which controlled printing or access to printed material and printing presses. So in a sense, it's not that different to the way in which, hopefully, the political left are now embracing the possibilities of social media, internet technology and all that goes with it, in a way of communicating with people outside of the power of the media corporations, in exactly the same way that the printed pamphlet could communicate with people outside of the authorised form of communication, which was via the army and the church, particularly the church, throughout the whole country at that time. What we learn from Liburne, we learn from the Levellers, later on is religious freedom, later on is the concepts of democracy and socialism. The Chartists owed a great deal to it, and the general ideas of socialists as a whole. What do we learn from it also? I think we learn, as much as anything, that history is the most controversial subject to study, because it opens minds, it excites people, it gives people inspiration, it provokes in them other ideas and parallels to their own situation. So somebody living under slavery anywhere in the world could look at what the Levellers sought to achieve and what they said, I'm going to quote this in a moment, in their final declaration, 1649. They also challenged the whole class nature of society and the idea that there had to be better and worse people in society, the idea there had to be social stratification and class. They also, to some extent, and I'm not sure to what extent, because maybe they didn't fully understand it because of the information not available, the levels of imperialism and colonialism, what there actually was to other peoples and to wars. But what they also felt and suffered a great deal from was the power of leadership and the opportunism of others. And so the English Civil War went well, went badly. Cromwell established a new model army with a very, very strong disciplinary structure. Was that a tap on the microphone or a cough? Well, sadly, a tap on the microphone. Okay, I'll be very brief. And Cromwell, of course, finally became a dictator on which many later dictators had modelled himself, and dealt with those that had actually supported him and got him into power. There are many, many other parallels to that. The last thing I want to say is this. if we want to change people's minds, change people's approaches and inspire them, we've got to learn from where our struggles have succeeded, where they've failed, where we've been successful, and where we've been very, very powerful. And I think the Levellers give us an example, not because they won everything at the end of the English Civil War, they clearly didn't. They clearly made way for a dictatorship which finally gave way to the return of the monarchy, but they also gave us some very important basic principles. And in the third and final agreement of the people, there's two little bits of it I want to quote. I won't read it all because it's an extremely long document. Was the one, we do not empower them, that's those in power, to impress or constrain any person to serve in war by sea or land, every man's conscience being to be satisfied in the justness of the cause, therein he hazards his own life and may destroy others. It then goes on quite a long section about how the future parliaments have to be conducted, particularly relating to salaries and expenses, very appropriate to today's day. And then the last part it says, thus has become a free people, thankful unto God for his blessed opportunities, and desirous to make use of his glory in taking off every yoke, removing every burden, in delivering the captive and setting the oppressed free. We have in all particular heads forementioned, done as we would done unto, and we trust in God will abolish all occasion of offence and discord, and produce the lasting peace and prosperity of this commonwealth. Those are very strong words, very powerful. They would do well to be taught in all our schools so our children may understand those that went before taught us so much, from which we've achieved so much since. Thank you very much.